Elias Rhodes had begun to fear the silence in his own home. It wasn't the kind that comforted a person after a long day, it was the kind that settled on the furniture like dust, collecting quietly until it became impossible to ignore. Some evenings, he would unlock the apartment door and pause in the entryway, listening for signs that Devon Hale was awake, moving, existing with him instead of beside him. More often than not, all he heard was the hum of the refrigerator and the faint echo of the city outside that he placed his keys in the bowl near the door with practiced motion, letting the weight of the day slide off his shoulders. Devon was asleep on the couch again, half covered with a throw blanket, his laptop open beside him and a spreadsheet glowing on the screen. His chest rose and fell steadily, but his face looked exhausted even in sleep. The sight filled Elias with an ache he struggled to name, something between love and loneliness. He leaned down and gently closed the laptop before the glare could bother Devon's rest. 4 years together had built a foundation that once felt unshakable. They had met at a small bookstore, bonding over a shared love for stories that reached inside the human heart. For a long stretch of time, being with Devon had felt like finding a chapter he never wanted to finish. But routines had a way of eroding wonder, and the last year had been a slow shift towards something neither of them could fully admit: they were drifting. Not because of resentment or betrayal, simply because life had grown too heavy for two people carrying different burdens. Elias worked in digital marketing, handling campaigns and brand strategies. His days were filled with fast decisions, crowded meeting rooms, and the weight of deadlines. Devon worked in finance, a world of calculations and relentless pressure. They still loved each other, or at least, Elias believed they did, but their schedules rarely aligned long enough for them to remember what that love felt like. The next morning, sunlight cut through the blinds just as Elias was tightening his tie. Devon shuffled out of the bedroom, rubbing his eyes. "You were up late," Elias said softly. Devon nodded, yawning. "Month-end reports." "I didn't want to wake you." Elias forced a smile. "You didn't." Their conversation ended there, swallowed by the sound of the coffee machine sputtering to life. Elias wished for something more, a question, a comment, even a complaint, but Devon moved around the kitchen like a man underwater, slow and distant. Elias kissed him on the cheek before leaving, but the kiss landed like a habit. At the office, everything felt sharper and more vivid. He stepped into the conference room just as the weekly briefing began. A new face stood near the screen, reviewing slides with quiet focus. Tall, well-groomed, undeniably composed, Elias recognized him from the internal email announcement. Micah Graves, the visiting consultant. There was something intriguing about the way Micah carried himself, self-assured, not arrogant, observant, not intrusive. His crisp blue shirt contrasted with warm brown eyes that scanned the room with deliberate interest. When he introduced himself, his voice held a calm confidence that immediately drew attention. "I'll be collaborating with your department for the next few weeks," Micah said. "I'm looking forward to understanding your workflow and finding ways to refine it." Elias didn't think much of it. People came and went all the time in his line of work. Yet when Micah's gaze briefly met his across the table, something unspoken flickered, a subtle recognition, a curiosity that Elias couldn't justify. After the meeting, Elias gathered his notes and prepared to return to his desk, but Micah approached with an easy, unhurried stride. "You're Elias, right?" "Yes," he replied. "Welcome aboard." Micah smiled. "Appreciate it. I'll need someone who knows the ropes around here." "From what I hear, you're that guy." Elias chuckled lightly. "Whoever told you that oversold it." "I doubt that," Micah said, his tone warm, his eyes steady. It was a small exchange, nothing unusual, nothing improper, but it stayed with Elias longer than he expected. There was sincerity in Micah's attentiveness, the kind that made a person feel seen in a way that was both comforting and unsettling. Over the next few days, their paths crossed often. Micah sought Elias's input during discussions, asked thoughtful questions, and listened with a focus that felt disarming. He didn't fill silence with idle chatter, he let Elias speak, genuinely absorbing every word. With Devon, silence had become a barrier. With Micah, it felt like an invitation. One afternoon, they were reviewing campaign analytics in a small breakout room. The door was slightly ajar, letting in the hum of conversation from the open office. Elias scrolled through data on the screen while Micah stood beside him, leaning in just close enough for Elias to sense the warmth of his presence. "You're thorough," Micah commented. "I like that." Elias shrugged. "Just trying to make sense of the numbers." "No," Micah said, his voice low but clear. "You see things other people miss." The statement was simple, but it landed in Elias's chest like a quiet revelation. Compliments from coworkers weren't rare, yet something about Micah's delivery felt personal, as if he were acknowledging a part of Elias that had long gone unnoticed. Their eyes met for a moment that lingered longer than it should have. Elias looked away first, grounding himself with a breath that he reminded himself that he had a life outside these office walls, a partner who relied on him, a relationship that deserved more attention than he'd been giving. Micah wasn't a threat. He was just new. Different. And difference had a way of shining too brightly against a backdrop of emotional drought. Later that evening, Elias returned home to find Devon working at the kitchen table. His expression was tight, his shoulders tense. "You okay?" Elias asked, setting down his bag. "Just stressed," Devon murmured without looking up. "Deadlines keep stacking up. Need help with anything?" Devon shook his head. "No. Just time." Elias stood there for a moment, wanting to bridge the invisible gap between them, but Devon's attention remained fixed on the screen. The moment felt fragile, like a thin piece of glass he didn't know how to touch without breaking. That he moved to the couch and sat quietly, scrolling through emails he didn't care about. The apartment was calm, almost peaceful, but Elias felt like he was drifting inside a still room with no anchor. He thought briefly of the breakout room, of Micah's steady gaze and thoughtful words. The comparison rose uninvited, and he pushed it away as quickly as it surfaced. Still, something inside him shifted, subtle, delicate, impossible to ignore. Later that night, as Devon slept beside him, Elias stared at the ceiling, listening to the soft rhythm of breathing. He reached out and lightly touched Devon's hand beneath the blanket. Devon didn't stir. Elias didn't know what he wanted: clarity, connection, or simply the echo of being noticed. But he knew something was changing, something he couldn't yet name but could no longer deny, and somewhere in that unspoken truth, the first crack quietly deepened. Elias Rhodes had begun to notice the way his thoughts wandered. It wasn't just idle curiosity or fleeting distraction, it was a persistent pull that made even the simplest days feel charged with an unspoken energy. He told himself it was just the novelty of a new coworker, someone different from the routine comfort of the office. And yet, when he arrived each morning, his mind flickered toward Micah Graves before he even opened his laptop. Micah had a way of noticing details others overlooked. He remembered Elias's coffee preference without being told, referenced a minor project from weeks prior, and asked questions that went beyond spreadsheets and performance metrics. Each interaction carried a subtle intensity, not overt, not inappropriate, but undeniable. In those moments, Elias felt as though he were being seen, fully and without pretense. For the first time in months. One late afternoon, a client's urgent request forced the team to stay past regular hours. The office emptied gradually, leaving only the soft hum of computers and the occasional clatter of coffee cups. Elias and Micah sat across from each other in the quiet, reviewing campaign analytics on dual screens. "You always catch the smallest anomalies," Micah said, leaning in slightly. "It's impressive." Elias shrugged, attempting nonchalance, but he felt a warmth he hadn't expected. "I guess years of staring at numbers do that to you." Micah's gaze held his longer than necessary, and for a moment, Elias felt his chest tighten. It wasn't romantic, not yet, but it was enough to remind him of what he had been missing: attention, understanding, and the simple reassurance of being appreciated. As they discussed the project, their conversation wandered. Micah asked about Elias's childhood, about the small dreams he had before work and life had taken over. Elias hesitated at first, accustomed to keeping personal details behind a carefully constructed wall. But Micah's patient tone and unwavering presence made him spill fragments he hadn't shared in years: a high school poetry contest he had lost, the summer he spent learning guitar, a fear of stagnating in life without growth. "You care about more than just work," Micah said softly. "That's rare." Elias laughed, though it was tinged with something heavier than amusement. I suppose so. But sometimes it doesn't feel like anyone notices. Micah's expression didn't shift, there was no judgment, only an openness that invited honesty. And in that space, Elias felt a thrill and a pang of guilt at the same time. He thought of Devon, exhausted from his own work, rarely present in the conversations that mattered. He thought of the nights spent side by side on the couch without sharing a word. The contrast between the two experiences was sharp and unavoidable. Later, Elias found himself walking to his car in the fading light, a subtle unease nesting in his chest. The city was quiet in the evening, the streets painted in gold by the setting sun. He ran his fingers along the strap of his messenger bag, thinking about Micah's calm demeanor, the way he made the mundane feel significant. At home, Devon was asleep again on the couch. Elias quietly set down his bag and watched him for a moment. He wanted to bridge the distance between them, but he didn't know how. Reaching out felt almost impossible. The conversation he longed to have dissolved into silence, leaving him suspended between longing and loyalty. The next day, their collaboration continued. Micah had a way of easing tension without words, simply by listening. During a brainstorming session, he noticed Elias frowning over a spreadsheet. Too much? Micah asked. Always too much, Elias muttered, half smiling. Micah leaned closer, not intrusively, just enough to let Elias feel the presence. It's okay to take a breath, he said, almost as if offering permission Elias hadn't realized he needed. The simplicity of the statement unsettled him, because it carried more weight than a casual remark ever could. They spent the next hour exchanging ideas, refining strategies, and debating minor adjustments with professional fervor. But beneath the work, there was an undercurrent that neither fully acknowledged. Every glance, every subtle gesture, carried an emotional resonance. Elias felt a mixture of excitement and dread. It was like standing on a ledge with no visible edge, aware of the fall but compelled by curiosity. During a short break, Micah reached over to adjust the position of a tablet on the desk. Their fingers brushed briefly, an accidental spark that lingered longer than it should have. Elias pulled back slightly, his heart hammering. It was nothing, he told himself, innocent, professional, but the lingering sensation refused to dissipate. You're quiet today, Micah observed, his voice low and calm. Elias tried to mask his flustered state with a shrug. Just focused. Micah studied him for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he smiled faintly. Focused, or thinking about something else? Elias froze. For a heartbeat, the office around them disappeared. He knew he shouldn't indulge the thought, but he did anyway. The quiet connection between them had grown into something Elias could neither ignore nor fully define. He glanced at the clock, surprised at how quickly time had passed, and realized he had lost himself in conversation and attention in a way that left him both exhilarated and guilty. That evening, the drive home was heavy with reflection. He tried to focus on Devon, imagined the warmth of the couch, the softness of the blanket, and the comforting rhythm of his partner's breathing. But the memory of Micah's attentiveness kept surfacing, like sunlight slipping through closed blinds. It was subtle, harmless, or so he hoped, but persistent. When Elias returned to the apartment, Devon was already asleep in bed. The room smelled faintly of the lavender spray he had been using for weeks. Elias paused, standing in the doorway, and observed Devon's steady breathing. He reached out and brushed a strand of hair from Devon's face, lingering longer than necessary, wishing for a closeness that felt just out of reach. That he climbed into bed beside him, feeling the weight of desire for something he could not yet name. Thoughts of Micah crept into his mind, delicate yet undeniable, a quiet storm that unsettled him. He closed his eyes, aware of the tension building inside him, not physical, not overt, but emotional, insistent, and impossible to ignore. And somewhere, in the silent half-dark of the bedroom, Elias realized that the line between attention and longing, loyalty and temptation, had blurred. The first choice had already been made, not an action, but a feeling. A feeling that, once acknowledged, could not be undone. The crack in the wall had widened, and Elias could feel the shift beneath him. He didn't know where it would lead, only that he was already falling, and the fall had no promise of gentle landing. Elias Rhodes woke to the faint hum of the city outside, sunlight slanting through the blinds in uneven streaks. The apartment was quiet, yet the silence carried a weight he could no longer ignore. He had spent the night tossing between thoughts of Devon and Micah, between loyalty and longing, and the edges of his heart ached in ways that made rest impossible. It had been days since he had spent meaningful time with Devon, days filled with stolen glances and lingering thoughts of someone else. And though nothing improper had happened, the emotional tether to Micah had grown in ways he could no longer dismiss. The realization left him unsettled, yet awake to something he had long denied. He craved connection, attentiveness, and understanding, and he hadn't felt fully alive for months. At work, Micah was waiting with the calm patience that had come to define his presence. The small office conference room felt warmer than usual, almost private, despite the glass walls and the distant hum of the main office. Elias settled into his chair, noting how the familiar sight of Micah brought both comfort and tension. "You look tired," Micah said softly, his eyes scanning Elias's face with a perceptive gentleness. "I am," Elias admitted, rubbing his temple. "Work, life, everything seems heavier lately." Micah nodded, leaning slightly forward. "It's okay to acknowledge that. We all carry too much at times. You don't have to pretend everything's fine." Elias blinked. The words felt weighty, but not accusatory. They were a quiet permission to be vulnerable, a permission he realized he had been withholding from himself. He sighed, letting the tension in his shoulders ease just slightly. "I guess I've been avoiding feelings," he admitted. "Avoiding reality." Micah offered a small, understanding smile. "Avoidance can feel safe, but it rarely leads anywhere meaningful. You deserve clarity, Elias, even if it's uncomfortable." The honesty of Micah's words hit harder than he expected. For a moment, the office around them disappeared, and all that remained was the soft cadence of their voices and the weight of their shared awareness. Elias realized that he had been clinging to comfort while ignoring the cracks in his own life. Later that evening, Elias returned home, the city quieting around him as twilight stretched across the skyline. Devon was on the couch, laptop open but eyes unfocused. Elias paused, searching for the right words. He had rehearsed the conversation endlessly in his mind, aware that it could shatter what remained of their connection, but also knowing that silence was no longer an option. "Devon," he began gently, "we need to talk." Devon looked up, startled, blinking against the dim light. "About what?" Elias hesitated, then drew a steadying breath. "About us. About me. I've been distant. Not intentionally, but I realize I've been drifting." Devon's shoulders slumped. "I know. I've felt it too. I didn't know how to reach you. Work, stress, it's been too much." Elias nodded, his throat tight. "I know. And I've been feeling something I can't ignore. Someone else has been showing me attention in ways I've been craving." Devon's face didn't flash with anger or shock, only a quiet, painful acknowledgement. "I guessed. I just hoped it was temporary, a phase, or maybe something I could fix if I tried harder." The admission hung in the air, heavy but necessary. Elias felt a strange mix of relief and sorrow. The conversation wasn't easy, it was raw, honest, and unavoidable, but it brought clarity they had both avoided for too long. A few days later, Elias met Micah at a quiet cafe, a neutral place where the conversation could exist without judgment or distraction. They sat across from each other, the hum of other patrons around them providing a gentle backdrop. The emotional tension between them had grown steadily, not through impulsive actions, but through persistent presence and understanding. "I need to be honest," Elias began, voice low. "I didn't come here to anything inappropriate. I came because I need to understand what this means for me." Micah nodded, calm and unwavering. "I didn't want to complicate your life. But I also couldn't ignore how much I care about what you're feeling. You deserve to be acknowledged, Elias, truly seen. And I wanted to be honest about that." Elias swallowed, feeling both the weight and relief of the words. It wasn't about instant decisions, or rash actions. It was about truth, emotional honesty he had long withheld. They spoke for hours, not about romance or physical attraction, but about needs, loneliness, and desire for connection. Elias admitted the longing he felt for Micah's attentiveness, and Micah shared the quiet admiration he had carried since the first day they met. The conversation was intimate, but not in a way that violated boundaries. Intimacy was emotional, not physical, and that made it all the more profound. As they prepared to leave, Micah reached out, resting a hand lightly over Elias's for a fleeting moment. It was gentle, grounding, and symbolic, a silent acknowledgement of shared vulnerability. Elias felt a rush of clarity. The emotional line had been crossed, yes, but not in a reckless or careless way. The crossing had been internal, deliberate, and necessary for him to understand what he truly wanted. Returning home that night, Elias knew the path ahead would not be simple. He and Devon had a decision to make: continue a relationship stretched thin by absence and emotional distance, or part ways with care, acknowledging the love they still carried but unable to sustain it in its current form. The next evening, he sat with Devon, the room softly lit by the table lamp. Their conversation was deliberate, careful, and full of honesty. They discussed feelings, needs, and boundaries. Tears were shed, not in anger, but in recognition of what they had shared and what they were losing. "I still care about you," Devon said quietly, voice trembling slightly. "But I understand now that we can't fix everything. I want you to be happy, even if that isn't with me." Elias reached across the table, gripping Devon's hand. "I care about you too. More than I realized. But I also need to live honestly with myself." The decision was mutual. They would part ways with respect and kindness, carrying the lessons and love forward without resentment. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. In the weeks that followed, Elias and Micah stayed in contact, exploring a tentative connection that was mindful, patient, and emotionally intentional. There was no rush, no pressure, only acknowledgement of feelings and the careful building of trust. Elias had crossed a line emotionally, yes, but it had been a line that revealed clarity, growth, and self-awareness. As he reflected on the journey, Elias realized that temptation and longing were not inherently destructive. They became meaningful when met with honesty, courage, and accountability. He had felt the pull, faced it, and now navigated it with awareness. The crack in the wall had widened, yes, but it had illuminated the space where truth, understanding, and emotional connection could finally exist. And in that illumination, Elias understood something crucial: love, in all its forms, required attention, care, and courage, not secrecy, not silence. He had learned to confront longing, not run from it, to embrace honesty, not fear it, and to recognize that connection, even when complicated, was worth seeking with integrity. The chapter did not close neatly, but it had clarity. And clarity, he realized, was the first step toward something real.